Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Swain's second ever virtual discussion series, Let's Talk, with today's topic revolving around diversity, inclusion, and more specifically, Native Americans and Indigenous people. For those of you who do not know, I also recently learned that since 1991, every president has designated November as National Native American Heritage Month. It is because of this, among many other reasons, we found tonight's topic to be an appropriate and necessary one to bring to the virtual table. My name is Veronica Boshin. I have been a faculty member at Swain for 6 years now, and I am honored to be moderating tonight's symposium. Today, we are again braving this conversation with honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to embrace the discomfort that will inevitably arrive throughout our dialogue. We ask everyone joining to bring an open heart and mind throughout our program, as our only mission is to continue Swain's inclusive culture for our students and to bring action awareness as we dismantle bias and prejudice through our own teaching, discussions, and examples. We would like to remind you that today's meeting is being recorded and will be posted to our website, swain.org, in addition to an information sheet provided by our guest speaker. This is a closed webinar and you have been muted by the host. No one can see you or hear you, so you do not have to worry about interrupting the program. While there is the option to use the chat feature, we ask that you allocate any questions you have for our discussion by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you feel more comfortable asking questions anonymously, the Q&A box allows you to do so. First up on today's agenda, I would like to give the floor to Swain's head of school, Dr. Armistead Webster, who will be sharing a follow-up to our first Let's Talk conversation, which took place this past July. Dr. Webster, welcome.
Hi, Veronica, and hello, everybody else. Thanks very much, first of all, Veronica, for all you've done to set up this evening and make it run so smoothly. Apologize for the bright lights over my head. I didn't realize this was where I was going to be at 7 o'clock. And also welcome in advance, Arla. It's been good to get to know you over the past few weeks and looking forward to hearing your presentation in a little while. And finally, welcome to everyone who is here with us for our second town hall this year. I really appreciate your taking the time to join us for this important conversation. You know, there is so much going on in our lives today. So much. And it would be easy to say we should wait to talk about being an anti-racist school and what that means until the pandemic has been eradicated and a new president sworn in and any number of other things have changed. I understand that feeling. And until a few years ago, I might have given into it. But I have come to realize that waiting allows harm to continue to be done to others in our community. Not to me, although not directly to me, indirectly, definitely to me. When we put off this conversation, we put off the day when our country is truly a place for all who live within her borders. We are here tonight because we believe this is an essential and important conversation to be having today and tomorrow and each day going forward. So what did you learn about Thanksgiving growing up? I was told that the first Thanksgiving was a celebration by the Pilgrims who invited the Indians to a feast to demonstrate that they were all friends and to show their appreciation for Squanto's help with planting their crop. Everyone enjoyed the feast and continued on their happy way. Of course, nobody told me that Squanto was one of the last of the Pawtuxet, a tribe that had lived in the region for 10,000 years and who had been decimated by the plague introduced by Europeans. Nobody told me that Squanto spoke English because he had been destined for slavery. And only recently did I learn that the term pilgrim was not what the Europeans who arrived at what is now called Plymouth even called themselves. It was first used in the 1800s to describe them. Our job as educators is to teach our students to be critical thinkers, to give them the tools to learn independently, and to provide them with stories and knowledge that are as true, complete, and inclusive as possible. Our job is to teach not only phonics and math and writing, but also the facts of history, and not only selected facts, but as much as we can to fully understand what has happened in this country and how there is a through line from then to now. History is not confined to the past. It has been said that the winners write history, as if that justifies misrepresenting the truth of what happened. History has always been about telling stories, both in the literal sense and in the sense of making things up to tell the storyteller's purpose. As white people, we have had the luxury of telling the story. And for hundreds of years, we have told that story in a very limited way. The time is long past due to tell the story more completely. Telling the story through the eyes of others is how we tell the whole story, how we balance the story, how we complete the story. The stories of all people on this land are intertwined. They became connected over 400 years ago when Europeans first came here, and most importantly, they continue to be connected today. White people can choose to recognize that or choose to ignore it. We must choose to broaden the story not only because it is the right thing to do, but because stories hold the cure. The incomplete story does not hurt only Native Americans. It hurts us all and has for hundreds of years. True learning and healing happens when we can see the world through the eyes of others, when we can open our hearts and minds to the experiences of others, and when we can truly feel what all humans have in common. By looking at the differences, we discover our shared humanity. That is our work here tonight and going forward. We must learn and talk about what it means to be an anti-racist school, and we must also take action. One action we took a few years ago was to change the way we teach about Thanksgiving and how we observe that day. And I'm looking forward to hearing a little more about that story in just a moment. So thank you all again for being here. Thank you, Veronica and Arla, and let's move onward.
Thank you, Armistead, for your continued dedication and work within our community. I know I speak for many when I say that Swain is lucky to have you as our leader. Next up on tonight's agenda is a faculty video regarding teaching practices and Thanksgiving. As Armistead noted, this has recently changed, and we are thankful to our Swain treasurer, Kelly Stout, for speaking her truth and sharing her experience through this evolution.
I started here at Swain in 2006. I actually taught pre-K, but my daughter was in kindergarten. This is when I first found out about the Thanksgiving program and how it was this wedding of Priscilla Mullins and John Alden, and my daughter got the part of the mother of the bride, and I thought, wow, this doing this performance. The following year, I became a kindergarten.
Veronica, I don't think the audio is coming through. Can you hear it?
So I didn't think
Is it coming through now?
much about it at the time, but it was the procession and the bride and the groom and
Veronica?
the maids and the ring bearer.
Can you hear it now? I'll start it over.
Well, I started here at Swain in 2000.
When you muted yourself, did you mute the audio?
Taught pre-K, but my daughter was in kindergarten. This is when I first found out about the Thanksgiving program and how it was this wedding of Priscilla Mullins and John Alden, and my daughter got the part of the mother of the bride, and I thought, wow, this is so exciting. It was actually a wedding. So I didn't think much about it at the time, but it was the procession and the bride and the groom and the bridesmaids and the ring bearer.
So Arla, can you hear the audio?
We went through a whole wedding
Okay.
service. But as a parent and a teacher, I was just looking at the smiles and how happy all the children were. They just looked engaged and really happy to be doing this performance. The following year, I became a kindergarten teacher, so I got to be more a part of the program. And that's when I just started thinking a little bit more about, what are we really asking these children to do? Do they truly understand what they're doing? And the process, it took us weeks to get them. They memorized lines, and the end product was beautiful, but the process seemed a little maybe not appropriate for the age of the children. There was at one point, we had another theater teacher named Robert Wagner, who came in, and he was asked to take this beautiful performance and tweak it a little bit. And how can we make it more appropriate for the children, but still keep the pieces of it? The costuming, what we knew at the time as the pilgrims coming over and the Native Americans helping them. And so he changed it to tableaus, and that was just a frozen picture. So the children got to act out the Thanksgiving story, still in the Gaelic or the costumes that they were given to wear, and much less of a process getting there, but the children understood, again, what we thought was the Thanksgiving program. So we did that for a few years. I was very anxious about that because it was a change, and I know the kindergarten teacher that I worked with had done it for years prior. So I was on board with the change, but I knew she was really resistant to it because it was something that she had done for a really long time. And then a change came where we were being a little bit more educated about what may have really happened, and were we telling the true story, and how could we change this again? And this is now, I'm taking the place of the kindergarten teacher who I was asking to change the program. Now I'm the kindergarten teacher, and I'm resisting it because I'm like, no, wait a minute, this is something they've been doing for a long time. There's a lot of ties to it, a lot of families who have been in it. The costume, like it just was, I could not grip the fact that they wanted to take those pieces away. And Miss Ocean came and said that she had some really great ideas, and I'm sure she would say she would know how nervous I was and how I was like, are you sure this is going to work? And I think she could see that I was really uneasy, and I just wanted it to be right for the kids. I just wanted the kids to enjoy it as much as they had enjoyed it. I still wanted them to understand it was about friendship and giving and thankfulness, and I wanted all those pieces to still be part of it. And so I was very resistant. But if I remember correctly, the first one was, I don't remember the name of it, but they were dressed as adults. I just remember sitting in the audience and just crying and thinking, it's still the friendship and the thankfulness and the love and what we want our children to grow up and be and understand. Every year, I think I've gotten less nervous, and I've been like, she's got it. And the kids enjoy the process. They get excited for it. And each year it's been different. So it's not the same, it's different, but it still has the core, I think, value of what we wanted from the original program, just a more current understanding of the Thanksgiving story.
On a personal note, I just really want to thank Kelly Stout for being honest and speaking her truth. It's not easy to be vulnerable, and I just really appreciate her bravery in this. So thank you, Kelly. Next up, actually finally on tonight's agenda, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Arla Patch. Arla holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Education and a Master's of Fine Arts. She is also a certified teacher in the state of Pennsylvania. Using art as a tool for healing and personal transformation, she has facilitated many groups and individuals over her 40-plus year career. She has taught art in both the public and private sectors. Her interest in healing has also included teaching incarcerated women in Maine and Washington State and incarcerated youth in Philadelphia. Arla went through the Central Bucks School District until her senior year when her family moved to Southeast Asia. She graduated from high school in Bangkok, Thailand, studied at Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, PA, and Rome, Italy, and did her graduate work at Indiana University. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, A Body Story and Finding Ground, Girls and Women in Recovery. Her interest in healing has also led to her involvement with the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States for what happened to Indigenous children in the child welfare system, the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission. She served as Community Engagement Coordinator for Maine Wabanaki Reach, Reconciliation, Engagement, Advocacy, Change, and Healing. Her work educating the non-Native community has continued in the Pennsylvania and New Jersey area through partnership with Kids Bridge Tolerance Center and 2 grants from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Through collaboration with the 3 tribal communities in New Jersey, an educational program was created, building greater understanding about Native American history, which has been shared numerous times over the past several years. More recently, she is a founding member of CNA, Coalition of Natives and Allies. She is a member of Doylestown Friends Meeting and served on their Peace and Social Justice Committee. On a more personal note, Arla is also a grandmother to a beautiful 3-year-old. Welcome, Arla.
Thank you. Do you bring up the slideshow? Great, thank you. First, I want to humbly acknowledge that we are on Lenape tribal territory, known as Lenapehoking. This is Chief Mark Gould, and he is the current chief of the Nanticoke Lenape Nation, one of the 3 that Veronica mentioned in New Jersey. And I'd like to thank Armistead Webster and Veronica Boshin and Aaron Coffey for the opportunity to speak as a Euro-American occupying unceded Indigenous land. Nearly all of us non-natives were not taught some basic truths about our shared history, and the ignorance of these facts has created much suffering and damage. And this lack of awareness winds up maintaining the original colonialism of our country right into the present day, and we do need to decolonize. I'm going to cover a lot in a short period of time, and I know it can feel very overwhelming. Part of what is included that Veronica mentioned is a fact sheet, because I'd love to ask all of you to actually be teachers going forward after tonight. I would love for you to take what you learned tonight and share it with other people so that this information can spread. It's also a very great step as an ally to be sharing what you learn. So I've heard many people say, well, my family came recently and we didn't have anything to do with this history. The fact is that anyone who is occupying this territory right now, whether for 200 years or 200 days, we benefit from the fact that Native people were targeted for destruction. So let me explain. First, I'd like you to imagine young children that you know, perhaps they're your own children or your grandchildren or even your neighbors, being taken by the government, by law, to a boarding school very far away from your home. And they were taken as young as the age of 4. They'd be forbidden to speak their only language that they knew. Their hair would be cut off. They'd be doused with DDT powder, which is a carcinogenic insecticide that's been outlawed. Their mouths would be washed out with lye if they spoke their own language. Siblings were separated and intentionally kept apart. So these children were emotionally isolated and deeply shamed. They'd be given foreign-sounding names, put in uniforms, and held to a rigid military regiment, which would be that next slide, Veronica. So you can see the aspect of the military aspect of it. And they had no parental love. They were forced also to practice a religion that told them that they had sinned and that they were savages. The Carlisle School is right here in Pennsylvania, and that was the flagship school and a model for all the Indian residential schools, not only all over the United States, but all over Canada. And the motto by Colonel Pratt was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." So in addition to the emotional abuse, there was really a good chance that they would also suffer physical and sexual abuse. And also possible that they would not even be returned home in the summer and they would be hired out to work on local farms. It's also possible that they would not return to their own communities until they were 18, not knowing the language, not understanding their culture, or being bonded with their parents or any parental figure. Often they were returned to the wrong tribal community as the records were lost. They would not have experienced loving parenting or a loving and supportive community. I'm sure you can imagine how devastating this would be for the children taken, but also how it would break the hearts of the parents and communities left behind when nearly all the children were taken generation after generation. This is what's called intergenerational trauma, a trauma that affects the next generation and then gets compounded with each repetition. This is what happened to many generations of Native people in this country. And the peak of the boarding schools era was in 1970s in the United States. And the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. In the 50s, this practice of the boarding schools actually morphed into policies of adoption and foster care that created the same result: parents losing their children and children losing their parents and their culture. This practice of high levels of adoption and foster care continues today. For example, in South Dakota, the Native children make up about 13% of the population, but they make up at least 54% of foster care population. The taking of Native children is just one of many violations to Indigenous people in this territory that we call the United States. It has left Native communities with the highest rates of socioeconomic distress in this country by far. There is a shameful history that we were not taught, a history of consistent policies, laws, and actions to decimate Native people since first contact 500 years ago. Here is one powerful underlying cause. 40 years before Columbus even sailed, the popes of Rome were putting out declarations. They were collectively called Doctrines of Christian Discovery, or Doctrines of Discovery. They essentially declared that if you land in a foreign territory and those inhabitants are not Christians, then they're the enemies of Christ. And you can, quoting from one of these documents, you can capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ and put them into perpetual slavery, take all their possessions and property. Essentially, they were nothing more than the wildlife that existed on that land. This is a very good example of early white privilege. So here's the sad part about these doctrines of discovery. They weren't just something as part of the 15th century. They were cited in federal cases throughout our history, and as recently as 2005, a Supreme Court case called Sherrill versus the Oneida Nation. And I'm really sorry when I learned that Ruth Bader Ginsburg delivered the opinion of the court that ruled against the Oneida. So Christopher Columbus never reached what is now known as the United States, and he and his men committed horrific atrocities documented in the diaries of a monk who observed them, Bartholomew de las Casas. Reading those accounts helps us understand why celebrating Columbus as a holiday and with statuary is really, truly unacceptable. Working to change that day to Indigenous Peoples Day in your community or university or school is another way to decolonize. 14 states have now celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day. Another very painful example are the bounties, another target of destruction. It's one of the practices in this country that in particular makes the use of sports teams named Redskins especially egregious. Bounties existed all over this country, and they placed a generous payoff for the bloody scalp of an Indian. And age was not an issue, as is written in this proclamation. There is even an amount for women and for children under the age of 12. Men brought the highest amount, a year's salary for clergy at the time, but you had to include genitals for proof of gender to get that higher rate. I'm going to mention just a few of the bounties in the United States. In the 1880s, the US government reimbursed the state of California over $924,000 in scalp bounty fees. The California Native population was reduced by 2/3 in one decade. And in our area, there was the Act of the Maryland General Assembly. That was from 1763, and they gave 50 pounds for the scalp of, quote, a hostile Indian, based only on the testimony of the settler. So there was a high incentive to murder Native families. And when the bloody scalps were brought into the collection centers, the clerk would ask, how many Redskins do you have? Indigenous people are the most highly legislated against of any group in our country. And I'm just going to mention 4 of them. The Civilization Fund Act provided the money for the Indian residential schools. And then in 1830, I actually had learned in history about the Trail of Tears, and this was from the 1830 Indian Removal Act. 46,000 Native people were forced off their land on foot in winter without adequate supplies, and over half didn't survive. And they were literally given smallpox-infused blankets. And there were multiple trails of tears, not just the Choctaw, but also the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, the Choctaw, and the Creek. Another law was the Dawes Act in 1887, and that took 93 million acres out of native land out of control. And all you need to really hear about this one was a quote from President Theodore Roosevelt. He said, "The Dawes Act is the mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass." And in 1882, our government outlawed Native American spiritual practices. And when I learned this, the thing that hit me was, wasn't this country founded on religious freedom? And Native people were not considered citizens until 1924. And this is probably the one that was one of the more heartbreaking for me, was voting. Did you know that Native people were not given the right to vote until 1954? And not in every state until 1962. Now, what makes this even more tragic and upsetting is that it's particularly outrageous when you consider Native people served disproportionately in high numbers in every military conflict since the beginning of this country. They even helped us win World War I and World War II as code talkers. So they died serving a country that denied them the right to vote. These disturbing truths, and I guess this, I don't see the bottom of this, but this shows at the bottom of the screen that this was another government policy to kill as many buffalo as we could, because we knew that the Plains Indians' survival depended on the buffalo. So these disturbing facts, especially for Euro-Americans like me, and if you hadn't heard that term before, it means that I'm an American of European descent. It can really bring up intense feelings. I felt grief, I felt guilt and shame. I felt some shock, like this can't really be true. And I've also felt anger. But what we can do with these feelings is that they can be metabolized or transformed, and they can be turned into fuel. And that fuel can create personal change. And also it can create actions in our communities. But what's really important that I learned is that those actions really do need to be under Native leadership. So the Dakota 38 is the largest mass execution in our country's history, and it was ordered by Abraham Lincoln. The evidence against the Dakota was very spare, the tribunal was biased, and the defendants were unrepresented because many of them didn't even speak English. There was a huge amount of revenge that the settlers wanted, and I do have to say that Abraham Lincoln culled down the numbers from a couple hundred down to 38. And I understand that this is a lot to take in at once, and it can feel overwhelming. And part of what can also help is if you feel empowered to be a teacher and share what you've learned, that's another important action in terms of being an ally. I do want to say something about allies, though, because it's not a title or a noun, it's actually a verb. And other actions that you can take are to continue to learn this history on your own and see your role in it. In fact, our coalition website has a really great section on education, which would be a good place to start. There's performative allyship, which is when you say the right things, you post the right links, and you carry the right signs. But true allyship is really not what makes you look good, but it's taking a deeper dive into how you might perpetuate colonial attitudes and behaviors. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're on this call tonight, you are doing that. There is an information sheet that we did mention, and part of what that covers is what allies do. And that might also be helpful in terms of moving forward. I myself in Maine, when I first learned this, I just felt stunned and I kind of didn't know how to move forward. So as a nation, we are really out of integrity with who we say we are and what we stand for when this history goes unnamed. But by not acknowledging this past and working toward healing it, we're also showing our children and the rest of the world a level of hypocrisy that I find impossible to justify. For over 200 years, the federal government policies were based on the assumption that either the annihilation or the assimilation of the tribes would be the solution to what we called the Indian problem. So in 1948, the UN made a definition for genocide, and the definition was very straightforward. Acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And as you can see, there are many articles here and how that would be manifested. I'm just going to take one of them and a little bit of a closer look. Article 2, Section A is the killing of members of the group. So I'm just going to give you a very tiny sampling of massacres. One of them locally that a lot of people don't know about is called Naden Hutton. And it was in 1782 where 96 Christian Lenape were bludgeoned to death. And they were mostly women and children. And here on the screen, you'll see just a few of the better known. The Clear Lake, 400, Sand Creek, 200, Wounded Knee Massacre, 300, Bear River Massacre, 400. Some of these are actually documented with photography also. Here's the part that is really hard for most non-Native people, and especially Americans who have a long history in this land and identity. We must recognize that our government engaged in each article in the definition of genocide. Great harm has come from not acknowledging this truth. And this image that you're seeing here is a result of the UN definition of Article 2, Section E, the forcibly transferring of children from one group to another, which led to that first Truth Commission that Veronica had mentioned to you in the state of Maine about what happened to Native children in the child welfare system. And this Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I had the honor to serve on that. And one of the findings that the commission came up with in 2015 at the end of their work was that, yes, in fact, Wabanaki children are still being taken at a rate 5 times higher than non-Native children. So this page is, and I'm not sure if what I'm seeing is exactly what you're seeing, but we're seeing kind of a close-up of it, I believe. It's a long list, the whole page, and the point is not to have you read each and every one of them. I'm sure that a Google search would bring them up too. The point that I just want to make for this page is that the legacy of genocide has left Native communities, as I had mentioned earlier, with the highest levels of socioeconomic distress of any group in our country by far. And in every single measure, what's important to remember is that their statistic is not a reflection on who they are, but on what has happened to them. So this is the image that I grew up on. I was taught in 5th grade a term called manifest destiny. And essentially that's just another word for the Doctrine of Discovery. It was white people's God-given right to conquer these lands. Now that you really need to understand is what you would call the Conqueror Mentality. And I'm going to use we. And when I say we, I'm actually talking about white people. We took their land. We took their resources. We took their lives. We took their children. And today, with Native sports mascots, we're taking their identity and we're telling them what it means. We generally say, we're honoring you. So it was okay, and what this says, if it's off your screen, is it says it was okay for these kids on the top of the screen to play Indians when it was not okay for these kids to actually be Indians. So as Veronica mentioned in the intro, I'm a founding member of the Coalition of Natives and Allies, and we're a cross-cultural collaborative acting as a resource to support ending racism and cultivating respect in any way that we can. Our website is on the information sheet, and you can also join the mailing list there. I want you to know that I'm the person who does the mailing list with my constant contact account, so you'll never get inundated. I mean, the most you might get if things are really moving is one a week, but it does give you an opportunity to stay abreast of what our coalition is doing. And our 4 core members, founding members, are 2 Native women and another ally and me. So one of the things that our coalition has come up with to support schools with this really difficult issue, and I'm glad you guys are the Panthers, I think. Animals are great mascots, just people are not good mascots. We came up with this sheet on how to actually honor Native Americans. And I'm not going to go over each and every one of them with you, but I think she's also added that or included that so that you can download this. Is that true, Veronica? Is
yes,
this something
this sheet and your fact sheet will go up on the website when we post the recording of tonight.
Great. Yeah, that's wonderful. And, you know, I said to the 8th graders when I spoke to them earlier in the week, I don't know if it's the same in your school, but we would often have a gift that the class would give to the school. I think a plaque acknowledging the territory that the school is housed on would be an awesome one. But this is a very helpful 6 steps where, and if you can see it at the bottom, there are 3 current important Native American people, and you may know that one of them on the bottom right is actually a representative to the federal government, to the Congress. There are 2 Native women who are now representatives. So there are many, many issues that confront Native people today. This photograph is just one of them. It includes the loss of their tribal lands, which this actually refers to, pollution, the oil pipelines, health services. One reason they got hit so much harder than any group by far was because of the health services that are underfunded and not supported for Indigenous people. Water rights, voting rights, missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is a whole subject unto itself, and much more. This example is how the state of Maine is now telling the Penobscot tribal nation, whose reservation is a series of islands in the Penobscot River, that their reservation no longer includes the river. Now, they have fished in time immemorial and sustained themselves on that river. And one of the things I found kind of interesting is that Maine has a lot of paper mills, and it could be that the paper mills want to be able to dump, and they don't want to have to keep the water clean enough for it to sustain edible fish. So colonization is really, truly an ongoing process. It's not something that ended in 1776. And with 98% depletion of the Native population in this country since first contact through many things, disease, war, and policies directly intended to reduce their numbers, and with the continuing to take resources and children, breaking treaties and ignoring sovereignty, there is a lot of repair to do. White people can step in and out of activism. This is an image from the pipeline, the response to the peaceful protests at the pipeline. As I was saying, white people can step in and out of activism and issues on racism, but people of color can't. White privilege has prevented change, but now that privilege can be leveraged in the service of this repair. I think the death of George Floyd, coupled with the pandemic, has created a change in the many defenses that were in place before. Coalitions like the one that I'm in are working together, facing really hard truths and listening in new ways and creating a common understanding of our shared history. That's what's so important. You can't really build community without a common understanding of our shared history, which is why I'm so glad you're on this call tonight. Minority voices are finally being heard now that we saw the startling truth of really what they've been saying to us all along. Native populations are more invisible, especially in states without recognized tribal communities, which would be Pennsylvania. There are no historic, ongoing, recognized tribal communities. And as the original inhabitants of this land that we now all enjoy, I just feel that it's foundational to support justice for this community. Healing and building community requires that we have a common understanding of our shared history. I can't say that enough. We have inherited this history together. And if we don't acknowledge it, we keep it in place, which is very much what Armistead was referring to. Unless you are Native, we have all come from other lands. And most of us have lost our ancestral tribal communities and territories. And that is a feeling of loss. I think that's why a lot of people embrace the identity of Native tribes in mascots so fervently, is because we long for that identity. But for the privilege to occupy the land, I think it's our obligation to work on our own decolonization. We need a marriage of the head and the heart. So this is my friend, the next slide is my friend Esther, who is Passamaquoddy. She was one of the core architects of the Truth Commission, and I worked very closely with her. And as you see, her sign says, "We're still here and we have friends." And this was an indication of the change in the attitude in the state of Maine when people started being educated and understanding. They were showing up at rallies at the State House in support of Native issues. So in spite of all this history that I've shared with you, it's really important to know that the resilience of Indigenous people of this land is strong. Among Native peoples, there is a movement of reclaiming their languages, their ceremonies, their traditions, food sovereignty, identity, and the healing from the residential schools. Working together, we can work toward healing this history that we've both inherited, and in partnership, and we can write a different ending. So I'm open to not only questions and answers, but also any responses, anything that might have come up for you that you would like to share. Because I have to tell you, in all those years in Maine, when I first started working on this, a lot came up and I did a lot of crying.
Thank you, Arla. Just on a personal note, it's been really cool just being able to connect with you outside of tonight, but really listening to you in your element tonight has been eye-opening for me. So I just want to encourage anyone, we do have a few questions already coming in, but if you have any questions or comments for Arla or for Dr. Webster, you can ask anonymously in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So we do have a few questions already, Arla, and Dr. Webster, feel free to chime in. But one of our parents actually asked, how can Swain teach about Native American history truthfully while also being developmentally appropriate?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I had a Native friend in Maine who, his name was Keisha Conakwe, and she had been a survivor of the schools and was working on her own recovery. And we started to co-present. And I'm a member of the Society of Friends. So there's a Quaker school in Portland, Maine. And they asked us to come and speak first at the school, which was a K-8 school. And then in the evening, there was an event open to the public, and there were about 300 people there. And my question to the head of school was, what ages do you want to include in our talk? And she said grades 5 through 8. And I said, well, you know, some of the subject matter, certainly we never talked about including genitals with the scalp. I mean, that would be a perfect example that wasn't even appropriate for high school, I don't think. But I asked her, you know, how do you feel about this? Because we're going to be talking about taking children and talking about that they suffered abuse. And her response was, the Native children actually had to live through that. So I think it's okay for our 5th graders on up to hear about it. And I have to say, in teaching those kids, I was really shocked at how much they already knew. But it is something that each teacher, knowing their class and having a sense of all of that, I think you can adapt it. That was one answer that, has been told, but there are many answers for depending on each school, each class. But I think there are some painful truths that do need to be heard, and changing the myth, the whitewashing, like the Thanksgiving, being a little more truthful about who Columbus really was. I think those are things that definitely a school could teach.
Yeah, and for anyone that had trouble with the audio for Kelly Stout's beautiful video, this presentation will also be posted to our website, so you'll be able to watch that again. So, Arla, we had another question about, have you been able...
I'd just like to chime in for a moment about the developmentally appropriate. Sorry, Veronica.
No, you're fine.
So Arla, I love what that principal said. And I also think that it's important before those kids get to 5th grade, that from a very early age, they have heard stories and seen picture books and been presented with a representation of Native Americans as just folks, right? As families, as mothers and fathers and children doing the things families do. And because you don't want kids to think that the whole story of being Native American is about the suffering and the atrocity and the harm that has been brought to that community historically, right?
Absolutely.
Kids need to have, I think, before they get presented with that painful history, they need to be presented with sort of a normalizing of or the humanizing, let's say, of Native Americans, right?
Yes.
Both in an historical context and in a modern present day context.
Yeah, and that's actually what's the damage that happens from the caricatures of the mascots, is it keeps them frozen in the past. It's really important for children to know that Native Americans are still here, and they are in small numbers. And just because we don't necessarily have recognized tribes in Pennsylvania, you might not even realize that a person is Indigenous and be interacting with them. So that's a great point, Armistead. Yeah, that's really important. And there's some really beautiful children's books that I've come across over this period of time that really do gently and carefully but poignantly tell these stories.
So, Arla, have you had any, this is coming from another one of our questions from the Q&A, have you worked with any schools that actually collaborate with I believe it said local natives or local Native American museums? We actually have one very close to Swain. So have you been a witness to any work such as that?
I haven't, but I'm also, this is a very nuanced and challenging subject, because in working with recognized tribes that are historical, in other words, they have been there since colonial times, in continuation, they definitely had to hide in plain sight much of the time, and were given different designations in census in order to stay safe. In Pennsylvania, it's trickier because there are groups of people who name themselves the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, for example, that I've heard, and yet they are more a group that would be a 501(c)(3). They're not an actual tribal community with tribal government, and though they might say they are the chief of the council. So it gets a little bit confusing, and I've even seen that Swarthmore had a woman who was claiming to be Native, and they did a study on her and found out she's not Native at all, and she was working with language. And so it becomes challenging. And in Maine, what we had were people who really wanted to be Native, or who knew in their verbal history of their family that there was maybe some Native blood, but they had no cultural ongoing connection, and they weren't tribal members. So they were putting together their idea of what it was to be Native by giving themselves Native names, by getting drumming circles. And that becomes really painful for those Native communities who are trying really hard to keep that authentic thread of their own genuine tribal connection. Now, I've heard that the museum, and I've yet to have an opportunity to go there and check it out, but I've heard that over the years it's had different membership and support and leadership that's come in and out of connection. And what's tough is that there are Lenape people in Pennsylvania. It's just the problem is the disruption and the breaking. Now, there are 3 or 4 very strong, federally recognized Lenape tribes in diaspora, in Oklahoma, in Wisconsin, and some in Canada. And they actually call themselves Delawares, but they are the Lenape people that got banished and chased out and removed. And there's a lot of work now happening where they're kind of coming back and connecting with those tribes in New Jersey and working out the delicate balance between those who left and those who stayed.
Thank you, Arla. We had another question about what would your advice be if someone were to see bias and hope to interrupt it, but not able to have all this information on hand that you explained tonight. What would you advise them to do in that moment?
Yeah, I can so relate to this because, I mean, you have to realize I started doing this work in 2011. So for me to be able to cite things and name things, that's one of the reasons why I do want you to have that sheet and print it out so that you can remember Doctrine of Discovery or whatever. But just to even intervene in the sense of saying, you know, that's not really the whole story. There's more to this. Even if you don't have the names and the facts and the dates, just to they call that being an upstander, you know, just to indicate that maybe this is not the whole story. I think that's a beginning. And then the more that you do learn, let's say something comes up about voting, and you can talk about that. Or if you're a veteran and you can find out that, I mean, talk about patriotism and sacrifice. I just can't even imagine people going and risking their lives and they could not even vote in the country that they were fighting for. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. We also had another question in regards to if you would be able to provide Swain. I know you're giving us so many amazing resources already, but we had a parent curious if you'd be able to give us a list of some of those books. You were talking about those children's books. We might have a few in our library, but I'm sure we could get them if not.
Yeah, I will absolutely do that. And there's also a film that you can download just on the internet. It was one that we used in the Ally training. And the only thing missing, and it's fairly dated, but it does cover a lot of these points. And it's called The Canary Effect. The Canary Effect. And you can just download it on the internet. It's a YouTube. The one thing that it doesn't do is it doesn't start back with the Doctrine of Discovery, which for me felt so foundational. It really felt like what was underneath all of this was that, you know, those declarations. And you think about in the years of popes and in the 1400s, when they spoke, it was as if God was speaking. I mean, it had that kind of authority. So the permission that he gave, and that's a really deep embedded white privilege that, you know, we all have from hundreds of years ago. So yes, a list of books, of especially children's books. And I can also just say The Canary Effect is a video that you could watch. There are actually quite a few really great videos. And we do have many of the resources on our website. It's just www.coalitionofnativesanallies.org. Coalition of Natives and Allies, all one word. And that would also be on that sheet.
Perfect. Thank you, Arla. You are a true treasure for us, and having the opportunity to hear your knowledge and learn from you has been amazing. So thank you.
I just saw one last question and an adult. One book, are we almost out of time? Yeah, one book that really helped me a lot is called Neither Wolf Nor Dog. Neither Wolf Nor Dog. And it's a really interesting story because it's an elder who contacted a white writer and said, I want you to come here and I'm going to tell you my story. And it was turned into a film, but the film I didn't think was as good as the book. So Neither Wolf Nor Dog is, it was one of those that I couldn't put down. but there are many. And yes, on a list of books, it'll be a mixture of adult and children.
Perfect.
And I will definitely send that to Veronica.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So at this time, even though I feel like we could continue talking for another hour, we will be ending tonight's program. However, we know that the work has just begun. Armistead, before I finish it off, do you have any final thoughts for the night?
I think just it's such a great reminder. Arla is reminding us that there are ways to move forward with this conversation, both in educating ourselves and in actions we can take. And you have experience and examples of what that looks like. So I appreciate you bringing that to the Swain community. And I also know that you'll be an ongoing resource for us, even though you're all the way over there in Bucks County, I believe. But
I'm in Quakertown.
Quakertown.
That's not too far.
Good. So thank you again, and thank you for what you've brought to us already and what you will bring to us in the future.
Yeah.
Well, and do I have a final word?
Absolutely.
Okay, because my final word is, having gone to school board meetings and spoken in person, actually, with a mask on, to school districts who absolutely reject and dig their heels in. In fact, there's one school district in Lower Bucks County who has invested $475,000 to keep the Redskin mascot. It's incredibly inspiring to see a school community open and willing to take on this really hard topic. And I do want you to know that I am available through email or follow-up for anyone who wants to ask another question or wants to express what this brought up for them. I don't want to just leave you raw and hurting. There is follow-up if you would like it, because this is more than just, it's a mission for me. So I'm happy to help others because I certainly needed help along the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yay, Swain School. Awesome.
So for everyone, we are so proud to be a part of the Swain community. We will continue to enact change through dialogue, learning, and our everyday actions within our teaching. Please remember to visit swain.org to watch tonight's recording and to grab all of those resources that Arla has talked about. And find us on social media to submit feedback on tonight's event. Thank you again and have a good night.
Good night,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Well done.